Good morning. I'm Charles Harrison. Today is Saturday, June the 8th, 2019. I'm at the Community Media Center in Westminster, Maryland, and I'm here today to talk with Mr. Barry Guckes as part of our Vietnam Oral History Collection. Good morning, Barry, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, sir. It's an honor to be here.
Well, listen, Barry, how did you get involved with the military? Were you drafted, or were you volunteering, or what?
So I came up out of high school at the end of the Vietnam era, and in 1975, believe it or not, our teachers were on strike, and so I was just dinking around our little town in part of Pittsburgh, and an Army recruiter was out on the sidewalk, and he and I got talking, and within 2 days, I had joined the Army.
So you listened to the promises that he made and was looking for a life of career and adventure.
Actually, I don't know this so much it was the promises as I knew I wasn't going to go to college. I mean, I had the grades for it, but I come from a very poor family and my parents couldn't afford to send me to college. So I knew I had to do something, and being from the steel city, the prospects of working in a steel mill all my life weren't really exciting. And so really, it was just an opportunity presented itself, and I heard what they had to say and what I might be able to do. And the all-volunteer Army had just really started in its infancy, I think, in '73. So they were just starting now to ramp up the all-volunteer Army. So, it sounded awesome.
Well, sometimes, Barry, what the promises of the recruiter don't match up to reality after you end up at boot camp. How did you find the boot camp and training experience?
So boot camp was everything that, of course, I come from, my dad and all his brothers were Army, so I kind of had an idea of what to anticipate for boot camp. I think the thing that was the biggest shock to me was they gave me this school title, the AIT that I went to, was to be a telecommunications center specialist. And man, that just sounded so awesome. Well, a telecommunications center specialist is a teletype operator. I mean, that's essentially what the job was. So it wasn't basic that was a shock to my system, although physically it was. The shock to my system was finding out really what job I was going to have.
Well, did you enjoy doing that job?
Well, I actually never did that job. After I got out of basic training in my AIT, I was sent to Germany, which in the mid-'70s, Vietnam is over, so if you're a soldier, you were either going to Germany or Korea. Pretty much those were your two. And so I went to Germany, and I was a signal corps guy, and so I went to the place where you got assigned, and the guy behind the desk said, you can either go to artillery or infantry. What do you want to do? And I said, well, I'm Signal Corps. He said, that doesn't matter. You're going to infantry or artillery. And so I said artillery, and I ended up being assigned to the 59th Ordnance Brigade. Now, the 59th Ordnance Brigade's job was to provide air defense artillery to NATO and to the U.S. services. So I ended up assigned to the 1st Belgian Air Force with the 507th U.S. Army Artillery Detachment. So we were basically 55 Americans assigned with 780 Belgians at a Nike Hercules missile site.
How did you find that experience working with foreign troops?
It really gave me an insight into the difference in the way that not only the Belgians, but because we were in a NATO environment, we worked with the Germans, with the British, and with the French. And so it really gave us an insight into the differences in the way that other countries' militaries, as opposed to the U.S.'s military, dealt with discipline and order and training, and even things like how they fed us were very different in the 5 different countries that we dealt with.
How would you rate the U.S. compared to the training of the Belgians or the Germans?
So I guess it depends on which side of the fence. Having lived through it and now many years past it, from a training and a discipline and a focus on doing your job, the U.S. was always head and shoulders above the other services. But on the other side of that, as far as recreation and using things like recreation and after-hours things for esprit de corps and military training, the other countries tended to be better at camaraderie and esprit de corps type activities.
Well, Barry, could you give us an example of a unique experience that you had while on that assignment?
Wow.
These are war stories.
Yes, well, I mean, I think about a couple of things that, you know, from a personal and a work side, so I'll do the works.
Okay.
We had of course, we stood guard duty. We had nuclear weapons at our site, and so we stood guard duty. And the way it worked was 2 of the towers had Belgian soldiers and 2 of the towers had American soldiers. And the idea is there was if somebody was approaching the fence, you were supposed to yell stop 3 times in English, German, and Flemish, fire 1 warning shot, and then you could, if you had to, engage somebody attacking. We had an incident while we were there of one of the Belgian soldiers. A guy came running through a field, and they later found out that he was filled up with drugs, but he came running towards the fence line screaming, and a Belgian soldier shot him and then yelled, stop, 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 halt, 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 and did the things backwards. And so it was very, to me, it was a very traumatic thing to see a guy that, you know, as I said, ended up finding out he was crazed on drugs. But that was sort of kind of another one of those discipline issues that, you know, between the U.S. and other countries' militaries.
I imagine that incident was quite dramatic and had an impact on the future training of U.S. soldiers.
Absolutely. The doctrine that was, you know, as all times, you know, an investigation happened, and the U.S. military took over the training of all tower guards after that to try to instill in the Belgian soldiers the same level of discipline that we received in our training courses.
Was did that incident cause a higher level of discipline or more discipline and impact on U.S. soldiers?
Not really. I think our level of discipline, we all understood. You know, I mean, the mindset in a nuclear environment is a little bit more strict than it is in a conventional warfare environment. And so I think for the U.S. soldiers, we were pretty highly trained. And I have to say that even, you know, the Army had the reputation in those days of not taking what would be considered the brightest of the bright sometimes, and yet the young men that I work with, and the young ladies that I work with at the nuclear sites, tended to be very professional and on point because they had to be.
Well, Barry, let's get on to your social side a little bit. Were you married during that time or a bachelor?
I was a bachelor. I joined when I was 17, and I got to Germany just after my 18th birthday. So I spent from ages 18 to 20 in Germany. Quite the shock. You know, the German culture is way different than the American culture is as far as things like drinking and the way men and women interact, and what we call entertainment in our country. Like, you know, in America there's movie theaters on, you know, in every town just about in those days had a movie theater, and roller skating was around, and in Germany most of their activities were centered around discotheques. There were a few movie theaters, but really discotheques, dancing and partying were the big. And you know, in America it was, well, I grew up in Pennsylvania where 21 was always the drinking age. You know, many of the states back then 18 was the drinking age. In Germany, as long as you could reach your hand up on a bar, you could get a beer.
Oh my goodness.
So it was, you know, that was a culture shock to deal with. So it was very interesting.
Well, how did you maintain contact with your family back home?
Well, letter writing, of course, was the primary way. The thing that was funny about, you know, today we get on our cell phones, and back then if you wanted to call home from Germany, you had to go to the post office. There weren't just telephones in the rooms or you had to go to the post office, and they give them the information and pay your money, and then they would do the connections to set up your phone call, and you sat in the post office basically and made your phone call. So letter writing and packages were packages from home. Even to this day, I think for military folks, packages from home are the thing you got to get. That's really your lifeline with home.
You mentioned doing your military experience with various cultures and individuals like Belgians, Germans, Finnish folk. Did you find that experience useful when you returned home in a multicultural society?
In two ways. On the fun side, if you will, or on the being another human being side, it was interesting to now have that perspective of, not everybody lives like Americans do. The late 70s were the time in America of a lot of social upheaval. I had been fortunate to have grown up in the inner city, so a lot of guys that I was stationed with, there were issues of racism and of course drugs at the late 70s in the military were really getting out of hand. But I really got an opportunity to understand some of the biases and the prejudices outside of U.S. Ours were black and white. In Europe, they weren't black and white. They were more like the French hated the Belgians and the reasons were things that were centered 300-400 years prior to the day we were in. So it was in that regard it was interesting, and from a psychology study, just really kind of fascinating. The other thing, though, that I learned was, and even to this day I tell people when we talk, Americans do not have a clue how good they have it in the world. Compared to all the rest of the world, the freedoms that we enjoy cannot, why do immigrants try to get into this country legally and illegally? Because we experience freedom as well as you can in the world. And that was my first real exposure to how that was. Later traveling around the world, in my Navy days, I got to be a lot more mobile in my experiences, and it never stopped to amaze me how much freedom we Americans have and how sometimes little we understand how much freedom we have.
So service gave you a heightened appreciation of those things that we cherish here in America. And noted that freedom is not free.
Amen.
All right. Well, listen, Barry, you mentioned Navy. That's quite a different perspective from a recruiter in the Army and service in the Army. Tell me about that transition. How did you get from the Army to the Navy?
Well, so my enlistment was up when I turned 20. My enlistment came up, and for various reasons, the Army and I were not 100% compatible with each other. Not that there was anything wrong with it. It wasn't for me. And so I came back to the States, and I got off of active duty just before my 21st birthday. I stayed in the Army National Guard because the one thing that I learned in the military early on was there's no place like the camaraderie that there is in the military. If even today, having retired now, I've been retired for 21 years, I miss that camaraderie. That's the one thing that people don't understand or know how to understand to deal with outside of the military. There's just something about being in a hole or being on a ship or being in a helicopter or being in a plane with a group of men and women in a combat or in a stress environment. You have to depend on each other. But anyway, so I went back I'm from Pittsburgh originally, and I went back to Pittsburgh. That was in 1979. Well, unfortunately, the steel industry died in Pittsburgh about that same time, and the job market quickly eroded to it, got very difficult to find work. And so while I was in the Army, I had been a teletype operator, and I had worked on some very interesting equipment in those years, plus working around the nuclear environment and all the higher tech equipment we had to use. Here I now am in Pittsburgh working for PNC Bank sticking checks in envelopes. And so it really wasn't, the challenge was gone. And so I happened to be at an event where there was a Navy and an Air Force recruiter there, and I got to talking to them, and both of them, of course, went into recruiter mode and telling me all the wonderful things that I could do if I joined their service. And so I dug in and learned a little bit about it, and Air Force and Navy were willing to offer me very similar programs, but the Navy let me keep my beard. And so I joined the Navy. And it's funny, but that's really I joined the Navy because I could keep my beard. Of course, now 4 years later, that ended.
Well, Barry, you seem to have a target on your chest that says, please recruit me. But we certainly here in the States appreciate your service. While in the Navy, what were some of the ports of call that you stopped at?
Well, so I've been all over the world. I've been to Spain, to Italy, to Israel. I've been to Saudi Arabia, Oman, Dubai, the United Arab Emirates. Mm-hmm. I've been to Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, Indonesia, Australia. I have literally circumnavigated the earth once, and been around the world 4 times, but altogether in mileage. But so I have had exposure to a lot of the world. I've been on 5 of the 7 continents. I think I last counted was 67 countries that I stopped in the course of my 20 years of service.
Well, what was the average day like being confined on a ship?
Well, most of the time you average an 18-hour workday. And people look at you when you say that like, what are you? But you do that because there's things that need to be done. The one thing that people I don't think understand is that ship, when it's at sea, is a floating city. Everything that you can find in an average sized city in America, we had on our ships. We had theaters. We took college professors with us, so we had college courses being taught. We had music, and we had different cultural things that were going on, and the ship runs 24 hours a day, and so the engine men have to keep the motors running, and the electricians got to keep the lights on, and the navigators got to know where the ship is going and what storms we're going to face. And so it's a floating city. It's a 24-hour-a-day kind of world. And so you learn quickly to kind of get into that rhythm. And honestly, it's kind of funny, but when we go into port and such like that, a lot of times it throws you off kilter because you're used to that 18-hour day. And now when you're in port, you're on what we 3-section duty, so the duty section works on their day, and the other 2 days you're free to go and see what's going on and visit the towns and the areas that you're in.
Could you tell us an interesting experience that you had while either on ship or in a port of call?
Well, I'll tell you kind of the defining moment of my life. So my very first, I got out of, so I didn't have to go through Navy boot camp. Because I had been prior service, I went to what they used to call Minuteman training. Mm-hmm. You go for 2.5 weeks, they restart your records, they issue you uniforms, and because the Navy has 2 unique training things, that's water survival and firefighting, that was part of that 2 weeks of training. You went and learned, because everybody in the Navy is a fireman. Because when you're out in the middle of the ocean, so I went from there to my first duty station was in Little Creek, Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia. I was assigned to the USS Boulder, which was a LST, a tank landing ship. And so basically, if you remember from the movie Saving Private Ryan, all those boats that came up and, we were the bigger ship that carried all those boats and tanks that hit the beach. So I had been on board for 8 weeks, and we were doing a final launch exercise prior to getting underway for a trip to Norway, and one of the tanks lost control and ran against the bulkhead that I was standing against and went through my right leg and about tore my leg off. And so I was medevaced off the ship and went to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, the Naval Hospital, and spent the next couple of years in there being rehabilitated and taught how to walk and all that again. So it was a very touch and go kind of time.
Yeah. Well, did you find the support and the medical treatment to be sufficient, and the follow-up?
So absolutely. One of the things that I think that is downplayed a lot in the world is the training that military people get in the military schools. The doctor who did the surgery to fix my leg told me that the two young corpsmen, medics that were on top of me, within 4 seconds of the accident, the first medic was next to me. And the doctor told me that had they not done exactly what they needed to do in exactly the right order, I would have lost my right leg. And through the entirety, the surgeons, the technicians, the nurses, the corpsmen, the therapists, I walk today because they stayed true to their training and did what had to be done to get me fixed. Now, obviously, I had to play in that role too, but I owe my life to that group of people that knew what they were about. And I mean, one of the saddest parts of my life is that I never got the chance to see those two young men who saved my life. You know, since I retired, I've been on trying to find those two guys and just to say thank you, because of them, I'm alive today, let alone able to walk.
Well, did you find that accident and that overall experience to color your general assessment of that period of service? Did it change anything for you?
I don't know that it changed anything. You know, I mean, any kind of trauma like that does something to your psyche. But, you know, I mean, going through the problem, I had to go to medical boards and, you know, the legal process. And at one point they were saying that I wasn't fit for service, but then they offered me 10% disability. And, you know, as a 22-year-old, how can you deal with that? And so I got a lawyer and I fought the system, and I went to a formal medical board, and, you know, in the end they said, okay, I was fit for full duty, but I couldn't go to sea for 5 years. And back in those days, the Navy had some jobs that never went to sea. And so I was able to change my rating, my job assignment, into one of those fields, which actually is probably the best thing that it could have happened to me, because I became a cryptologic technician. And after my retirement, it basically opened the door for me for my second career, which I just retired from last year. So I did another almost 21 years working for the National Security Agency. So, I mean, it actually, you know, the silver lining, if you choose to look for those, is that it pushed me into a career path that was fairly exciting and lucrative for me.
Well, that is terrific. I'm happy the transition worked out well. Did you utilize any of your government or GI benefits?
I did, not until I retired, but so I went to work. When I retired, I went to work as a contractor, and one of the things that the U.S. government in the 90s, before 9/11, was pushing was to try to hire all college graduates, or at least 85% college graduates. And so even though I had the skill sets and the background to do the work, I was not able to get some of the jobs that I applied for because I didn't have that college degree. And so I used my GI Bill, went back, and ended up getting my bachelor's degree in 2004.
That's terrific.
So at 44 years old, I finally got a college degree.
That's an excellent experience and utilization of those benefits. What about housing? Did you use your GI Bill to purchase to get a home?
And I've used the GI Bill 3 times, as a matter of fact, to buy houses. Yeah, I mean, the nice thing is once you pay off the loan, you're eligible to open up another one. So you know, that's a lifelong benefit.
Yeah, I found those benefits to be of great advantage to ex-service people. But however, nowadays the servicemen don't have those same opportunities at the same level. How do you feel about that?
Well, I guess I hearken back to the men and women that served in World War II. You know, they were promised when they were drafted and they went through what they went through, they were promised benefits for life. And nobody ever rescinded that promise. You know, and I think often to myself, of course, like I said, I was, I don't know if I'd call it the beneficiary or how I would describe it, but because I came in at the end of the Vietnam era, I had a first-hand look at how our men and women who served in Vietnam were treated in this country. And it still breaks my heart to this day to see the anguish and even though there's a renewed effort to try to thank Vietnam veterans, I can't imagine the scars that they have on their hearts from the way that they were treated by our country for doing what they were asked to do. You know, what is it? 80% of the Vietnam service people were draftees, and yet they were treated like they were dogs on the way home. One of the experiences that's been a kind of cornerstone of my service was when I got out of basic training in AIT. I was in Fort Gordon, Georgia for that. Well, I flew through Atlanta on my way home for my first leave. And I was walking through the airport. Of course, back in those days, you had to wear your uniform before you. And a guy came up and spit on me and called me a baby killer. Ooh. Well, now I had never been to Vietnam. I wasn't old enough to have been in Vietnam. And I just stood there for a minute. And fortunately for me, there was a sergeant major in the USO, I was right by the USO when that happened. And this sergeant major came out, retiree, and put his arm around me and kind of schooled me on the facts of life about people and hatred and all that stuff. And so, but I still, to this day, I mean, that happened 45 years ago, and it's still, I can't get it out of my mind that somebody would spit on a soldier for doing what they were forced to do.
Yeah, it's hard to conceive. What do you think about the draft? Do you think we ought to reinstitute a draft, or that every able-bodied citizen should serve this country in some manner?
I have felt that way since I was young. Okay, I dig it. Not everybody's cut out for the military, but there's the U.S. Park Service. There's Housing and Human Services. There's hundreds of agencies in America that could come up with volunteer programs that would give our youth an opportunity to understand the joy of service to our country. Yeah, I mean, we're one of only a handful of countries in the world that does not have some kind of a service requirement upon graduation from high school. I mean, how can people know what they have in this country if they never have to serve this country?
I see. Well, Barry, do you belong to any veterans organizations or?
Yes, I'm in the Veterans of Foreign Wars. I'm in the Disabled American Veterans. I just recently reaffiliated with the American Legion. So I'm a strong proponent of service, and you know, it's kind of a shame that the children and the generation after me, including my own son, just couldn't entice them to even think about joining the service. And it's you know, it's sort of kind of one of those little burrs in my saddle, if you will, that anyway.
I understand. Well, Barry, is there anything that you'd like to comment on or add that you feel we haven't covered during this interview?
Well, we didn't talk a lot about Navy time, and I just want to kind of kick the can down the road that I served in the Gulf War and spent 5 or 6 combat patrols in the Middle East.
Well, tell us about it.
Well, I was during the first war. I was on the Saratoga, sitting off the coast, and the first pilot lost in the desert war was from the Saratoga. And people think, well, you're in the Navy, you're not up with the other guys, you're not in combat. but it's never easy to lose a fellow service member. And you know, the folks that are back on the ship that are doing all the work to prep that plane to go in and do its mission are just as attached to that mission as the pilot is on the front seat of it. You know, a lot of times people think that sailors are, you know, a little bit aloof to it all, and yet being in the Navy is just as engaged in the combat as everybody else is, and hurt just as bad when we lose a couple of soldiers or airmen or Marines or Coast Guardmen. You know, it's hard for all of us to lose our friends and our comrades, if you will. So I think that the naval service and the things that we did in the naval service sometimes, and I don't mean they don't get overlooked, but you know, like, I mean, one of the big things that I know that there's a big fight right now is the Navy guys that were off the coast of Vietnam. You know, they were in the area where that Agent Orange was blowing onto them as well, and yet the VA still is reluctant to provide them health coverage for Agent Orange issues, and it's because a lot of people think, well, you're off the coast, you're not. But you know, we're just engaged in those battles as the Army and in the Marines and all that go. So I feel compelled to give a shout out that, you know, we're there too. We're providing our part of the role. So.
Okay, so you feel that the government hasn't really lived up to its responsibility and the promises that it made in relationship to Agent Orange victims?
Yeah, I think in that particular sense and a few others that they're, you know, I understand the money issue. I mean, I understand that it's costly to take care of veterans, but you know, when you send somebody off and I mean, people don't understand how far-reaching this PTSD. I mean, having seen people die, you just don't, you know, I mean, it reaches into your soul. You know, and if you have half a conscience, it even reaches deeper down. You know, I sort of kind of I feel bad for people that don't understand these kids coming home from Afghanistan today, just like the kids that came home from Vietnam. You know, their lives are kind of ruined, and it takes extraordinary service of medical technicians to try to give them a chance to have their lives restored. And I think we as America have got to get behind the medical stuff to get these young men and women the services that they need to overcome some of the trauma that they've seen in that particular battle. We dropped the ball with Vietnam. We can't do it again.
True. Well, Barry, we certainly appreciate your effort and your comments, and perhaps people will view your interview and join the fight to ensure that our government lives up to its obligation to those who serve so valiantly. Barry, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your service again, and thank you for the contributions that you as service members continue to make to our community.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.